Dear students, welcome to this lecture on Aristotle's criticism of Plato. The main objectives of this lecture are, firstly, to underline Plato's influence on Aristotle, secondly, to highlight the agreements of Aristotle with Plato's political philosophy briefly, thirdly, to offer a detailed account of Aristotle's criticism of Plato, and lastly, why did Aristotle specifically reject Plato's communism of property and family? The ancient Western political philosophy is principally known by the works of Plato and Aristotle. The two philosophers exerted tremendous influence over the world of philosophy to the point that philosophy was said to be either Platonic or Aristotelian. Such a division was said to lead to somewhat irreconcilable contestation between idealism and realism. A close examination of the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle makes one conclude that such a strict division between the two does not exist. Both are philosophers, one abstract, speculative, and the other a philosopher-scientist. The two great Greek philosophers engaged with the questions of politics, ethics, collective life, and justice. In fact, both had the visions of ideal state, though the two differed in terms of approaching and making of such ideal states. In this lecture, we attempt to discuss mainly two questions. What does Aristotle inherit from Plato, or in what ways Plato influences Aristotle? And second, where does Aristotle differ from Plato's vision of ideal state, more particularly communism of property and family sketched by Plato in the Republic? Or why was Aristotle anti-communism? So let's first discuss Plato's influence on Aristotle. Aristotle joined Plato's academy at the age of 17 in 367 BCE and remained there for 20 years as Plato's student. At the time of Aristotle's arrival to the academy, Plato was almost 60 years old and had written another great work, The Statesman. He had authored the Republic at the age of 40, and thus his most famous work was already 2 decades old. Plato had begun to study the constitutions and was engaged in categorizing the pure and perverted forms of government. It also means that Plato was emerging out of the influence of Socrates and was almost set to work on his more mature works. He had himself abandoned various radical elements of the Republic and had begun, for example, to acknowledge the efficacy of private property and family. It is evident from Plato's mature works that communism of property and family did not find a place in his own writings. Instead, he was for private property and family, but would subject these life functions to a well-defined law. In his last work, The Laws, for example, he developed a set of laws for marriage and laid down various conditions for the consensual marriage system with defined obligations of the contract. Such a change in Plato's own works must be kept in mind for proper understanding of Aristotle's criticism of Plato's works. In other words, we can say that when Aristotle joined Plato's The Academy, Plato had himself become a critic of some of the ideas of his own work, The Republic. He no longer subscribed to communism. Aristotle was the ablest of the disciples of Plato and deserved headship of the Academy after Plato's death. That did not happen, and it was Plato's nephew who succeeded Plato as the head of the Academy. Aristotle left the Academy and Athens immediately after Plato's death. Aristotle admired and loved his teacher Plato. On Plato's death, he expressed his admiration, calling Plato a man whom it is not right for evil men even to praise, who alone, or first of mortals, proved clearly by his own life and by the course of his arguments that a man becomes good and happy at the same time. Aristotle loved Plato but was not a Platonist. He would say that Plato was dear, but dearer is the truth. Though Aristotle criticized Plato and rejected many Platonist theories, but he was profoundly influenced by Plato. Jonathan Barnes, a scholar of Aristotelian philosophy, identifies 5 philosophical issues Aristotle inherited from Plato. First, unity of sciences. For Plato, human knowledges had a potential for developing a unified system. The mere collection of random facts could be organized into a coherent account of world. Aristotle developed a systematic and unified sciences. He might have disagreed with Plato in approaching unified sciences, but he shared Plato's vision. For the organization of knowledges, Aristotle classified sciences into 3 categories. A. Theoretical, which includes theology, mathematics, and physics. B. Practical, which includes individual practical wisdom, household science, economics, and politics. And finally, C. Productive, which includes arts and crafts. All the 3 kinds of knowledges have defined purposes with them. Such a delineation of aims or purposes of activities is called teleology. Second, the science of logic. While Plato was a dialectician, Aristotle was a logician. Plato had prepared the ground for the development of logic that was later formally invented by Aristotle. Plato was a stringent critic of rhetoric and had defended the case of philosophy in all his major works, including Symposium, Apology, The Republic, etc. He deeply encouraged exercise and development of science of logic, notably in his 2 dialogues, Parmenides and the Sophist. He trained his students in logic and argumentation. Aristotle developed it fully and invented formal logic, so he is the first formal logician. Third, ontology. Ontology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the question of being or true existence. It attempts to define what does really exist. In all his dialogues, Plato was concerned with ontological questions and investigated about the true existence of the things dialectically. He famously developed theory of forms as a set of his ideas about the existence of things. Plato was mainly concerned with the abstract universal and did not bother about the accidental particular. To him, the reality of the things depends on their universal form that is partially reflected in the material appearance. While as the matter, say for example human body or the material appearance, the shape, size, color, etc. is the mere reflection of the real, it cannot and does not represent the real. Rather, it is reflection only. For example, while as the actual cat is a reflection or an image, the catness is the abstract universal and the real cat. The idea alone is the real. Aristotle, on the other hand, develops an alternative theory of ontology. This question occupied Aristotle throughout his life, even though he disagreed with Plato's theory of forms. Instead, he inductively attempted to define nature and nature of things. To him, there is a purpose or an end of a thing. The investigation of the purpose leads us to the nature of the thing. Therefore, nature, existence, and purpose of a thing are interwoven together and represent reality of a thing. Material existence represents an inward reality of the thing and cannot be said to be a mere reflection. In principle, both agreed that the existence is a philosophical problem. Next, explanatory knowledge. Plato was concerned with the explanation of occurrences and examined dialectically the causes of the phenomena, for example, the perversion of governments and emergence of tyrannies. His concern for cause, conditions, and occurrence of event as part of explanation influenced Aristotle. Jonathan Barnes writes, Aristotle inherited that concern. He too ties knowledge to explanation. His scientific endeavors were directed not merely to observing and recording, but above all to explaining. The fifth and the last, epistemology. Epistemology is a branch of philosophy that deals with the questions of knowing and knowledge. It mainly engages with what can be known, how do we know what we know, what are reliable sources of knowledge, and what are the limits of human knowledge. What is knowledge, the true knowledge? Every philosopher is concerned with the notions of knowledge. The epistemological position of a philosopher determines her engagement with the ontological questions. Plato not only questioned the notions of knowledges of his predecessors, but developed his own episteme that influenced the entire Western philosophical tradition, including Aristotle. Aristotle inherited the questions of soul, God, nature, and polity from Plato. Summing up these fivefold influences, Barnes concludes, knowledge must be systematic and unified. Its structure is given by logic, and its unity rests at the bottom on ontology. It is essentially explanatory, it poses deep philosophical problems, all that and much more Aristotle learned in the academy. However profoundly he disagreed with Plato's detailed elaboration of those five issues, he was at one with Plato in principle. Additionally, there are some broader agreements between the two great Greek philosophers. Plato's tripartite division of the humans had a fundamental undercurrent. That is, there is inborn inequality and the difference of the individual capacities, which ought to resonate in access to political affairs of the polity. Plato reserved the political decision-making rights to the guardian class only, and the basic metric of availability of political rights was the capacity for and power of knowledge. Aristotle also believed in natural inequality and denied political rights to intellectually inferior persons of the community. In his theory, slaves, women, children, and old people could not become citizens. Plato had, however, granted guardianship rights to women. Both believed that politics and ethics share a link. The two texts, the Republic and the Politics, engage with the questions of moral and political philosophy. Both the philosophers did not appreciate democracy. While Plato classified the governments in his Republic as aristocracy, democracy, oligarchy, democracy, and tyranny, in the Statesman he offered a classification like monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, which are further divided as monarchy into royalty and tyranny, oligarchy into aristocracy and plutocracy, and democracy into good democracy and bad democracy. Aristotle broadly accepts the working of constitutions into true and perverted, and offers a classification of various types of governments quite close to that of his master. In Book 7 of the Politics, Aristotle sketches his best and ideal state. In his ideal state, he sounds like his teacher in substance, though differs in approach and method. Commenting on Plato's influence on Aristotle, Eric Voegelin, a great 20th century philosopher, says, "It is certain that the early works were not only formally related to the Socratic dialogues of Plato, but that Aristotle had absorbed and made his own the Platonic conception of philosophy as a movement of the soul. Philosophy as a mode of life in the Platonic Socratic sense had formed the soul of Aristotle, and the imprint was indelible." Now let us discuss Aristotle's criticism of Plato's Republic. There is a division in scholarship with regard to Aristotle's criticism of Plato's Republic in his classical work, The Politics. The Neoplatonists had always argued that Aristotle was mistaken in his rejection of the Republic. Aristotle did not treat the Republic as a whole, rather selectively critiqued a couple of sections dealing with the communism of property and family. They argue that such a selective treatment misses the larger scheme of Plato's work as a whole. Scholars like Benjamin Jowett, Bornemann, Suzumill, and Hicks argue that Aristotle's reading of the Republic suffers a misconception, meaninglessness, and carelessness, and thus there is some sort of a misjudgment about Plato's political theory. The defenders of Aristotle do agree that the Politics of Aristotle does not treat Republic comprehensively and is focused on one of the components of the ideal state, that is, communism. They argue that the book 2 of the Politics critically evaluates radical idealist principles of ideal constitutions that includes Plato's Republic and laws and some other constitutional types. The larger point of such a selective critique is to mark or identify the reference points for Aristotle's own theory. We now turn to his rejection of Plato's communism. In the very first passage of the book 2 of the Politics, Aristotle raises a question: what form of political association is the ideal for those who can count upon the material conditions of their life being just, from the point of what is right and what is useful? To Aristotle, one of the principal functions of the political community is sharing and having in common. In fact, the Greek term used for community, koinonia, literally means having in common. Aristotle underlines 3 possibilities of sharing. First, sharing nothing. Second, sharing everything that can be shared. And third, sharing in some things but not others. In community, the first possibility is ruled out instantly, for humans are not self-sufficient. Therefore, not sharing is not possible. Sharing in everything would give rise to disputes, and everything cannot be available for common use. Aristotle prefers the third principle, sharing in some things. Where does Plato's communism fall in the 3? Plato's theory of communism declares that the guardian classes of the state shall have everything in common: property, wives, children, households, and even kitchen. Aristotle thus flags a question: which sharing mechanism is better and preferable? In the Republic, Plato argues that the unity is the greatest good of the community, and it is the force that binds it together in pain and pleasure. The unity between body and soul makes a person feel pain and pleasure in the entire body. In such a unity, there is no mine or thine, but an organic unison between the components of human life. Plato intends to develop such a unity in his ideal state so that every individual in the state shares and feels the same pain and pleasure. The creation of a single family with everything common is the means by which the goal of unity of the state is meant to be achieved. Aristotle has a problem with both the end as well as the means. First, let's discuss his criticism of the end. According to Aristotle, the basic problem with Plato's Republic is its assumption that the absolute unity of the state is the supreme good, and such an organic unity as that of an individual at the level of city is goodness. The state, according to Aristotle, is a larger entity than that of a household or a village. The city-state is thus at lesser unity than a village, and village is at a lesser unity than a household. Individual is at a greater unity in terms of her choices and other things than that of a household. To him, the essential character of a state or city lies in its plurality, and to condense the plurality of the city into crude unity would destroy the city. In chapter 2 of the book 2nd of the Politics, Aristotle says, "It is obvious that a polis which goes on and becomes more and more of a unit will eventually cease to be a polis at all. A polis by its nature is some sort of aggregation, that is, it has the quality of including a large number of members." Further, Aristotle argues that a polis is different from an alliance or a tribe, for the latter are defined by limited goals and purposes. These do not involve the ethical questions of collective life. Aristotle believed that the state or polis is composed of not only a number of individuals, but different kinds of individuals. Plurality is not an evil, but qualitative goodness that enriches the polis to attain a better life. Not only is the polis composed of a number of men, it is also composed of different kinds of men, for similar cannot bring it into existence. A polis is essentially different. It necessarily requires a difference of capacities among its members, which enables them to serve as complements to one another and to attain a higher and better life by mutual exchange of their different services. Thus, the real unity of the polis lies not in the similitude, but in the multitude. The polis is an aggregation, not assimilation of its members. They do not differ in number, but in kind too. Therefore, the end of Plato's communism suffers from theoretical and practical drawbacks. This, according to Aristotle, is contrary to the nature as well as human nature. Now let's discuss his criticism of the means. Aristotle criticizes Plato's communism on practical grounds as well. The index of unity proposed by the Republic, that is, communism of wives, children, and property, are impracticable. There is a deep ambiguity in a political norm that expects the members of all the members of guardian classes to say mine and not mine at the same time for the same things. On the basis of common experience, Aristotle argues that the thing that is associated with all is not a thing at all. A thing caught in the duality of mine and not mine evokes no emotion at all. Such a notion of common owning and use of things, including children, does not create any unity. People generally do not pay attention to the things that are commonly owned. Private goods are consonant with the human nature. On the basis of logic, he proves impracticability of communism as well. For example, if 1,000 children are born to 1,000 couples in this communist model, that means that a child is 1,000th child of 1,000 parents, and similarly, a father is 1,000th father of every child. It means that a father has 1,000 children that are his and not his at the same time. He says, the scheme of Plato means that each citizen will have 1,000 sons. They will not be the sons of each citizen individually. Any and every son will be equally the son of any and every father, and the result will be that every son will be equally neglected by every father. This formula will not generate harmony, instead would result in loss of harmony. Such a system would eventually develop a culture of inattention and gross neglect of the children, adult, old, and women. It is bound to develop an uncertainty condition where no one can be sure of anything. An adult, for example, cannot even be sure that he is as much as the 1,000th part of a father, and for a father there is no evidence who had a child born to him, or whether, if one was born, it managed to survive. Additionally, there is a loss of fraternity, for the familial structure is the bedrock of the fraternity. There are more difficulties of such communist model. In case the children display facial similarities with their potential parents in the guardian classes, it too will have adverse effects on the goal of unity of the state. Some would be attended more and others less. It would result in assaults and conflicts. Much of the criticism of the communism of family also applies to the communism of property. Aristotle offers a threefold possibility here too. First, common ownership, common use. Second, common ownership, private use. Third, private ownership, common use. We can also propose a fourth possibility, private ownership, private use. Aristotle categorically rejects the common ownership, for everyone's ownership is nobody's ownership. And if someone works on a land commonly owned by all, the produce will create disputes on use. Unless the labor benefits for private possession, the ownership does not yield any happiness. There is an added difficulty here. Some will work hard and others less. The produced lot will become matters of contestations and disputes. Similarly, common ownership and private use is not feasible. In the same way, the fourth one, private ownership and private use, will be problematic because the goods owned by the head of the family will not be available to the members of family, including the women and slaves. In fact, the goods may not be available for use or work to anyone. The owner of a piece of land will not be available for work or use to anyone else except the owner. Aristotle prefers the third possibility. He argued that the private possession or property is necessary for it can be put to common use. For example, the household goods owned by master or citizen, including land, animals, produce, etc., can be used by the members of the family and slaves. The private ownership is necessary for goodness, and the two ethical virtues, namely temperance and generosity, are exercised only through private property. It has other benefits like expressions of kindness, assistance, hospitality, and charity. These activities are possible only with the private property. Aristotle links private property with ethical virtues and can lead to human happiness. In conclusion, one can infer from Aristotle's criticism of Plato's Republic that human diversity, plurality of capacities, and varied visions of life are essential contributory factors to a worthwhile life. The human happiness and success of life is possible with the recognition and promotion of plurality. This philosophical line of thinking has influenced many contemporary political and social philosophers. With this, we come to the end of today's lecture. Hope you enjoyed watching it. Thank you.